The moment the auction failed, everything shifted. A trillion-dollar government watched buyers walk away from its longest-term debt, and the silence that followed was louder than any crisis alert. Within the same news cycle, Beijing tightened control over the minerals that keep America's factories alive, and Wall Street analysts discovered stablecoin reserves moving in directions Scott Bessent never planned for. Then came the geopolitical twist. Reports alleging Washington quietly urged Japan to dial back pressure on China. An allegation Tokyo denied, but one that exposed a deeper truth. The United States is running out of fiscal room, out of strategic leverage, and out of time. All at once. The U.S. deficit only amplifies that pressure. Treasury disclosures from late October showed a federal shortfall of roughly $284 billion for the month, the worst opening to a fiscal year on record according to the Financial Times. Government outlays rose at a double-digit pace, driven partly by higher interest payments that Bloomberg calculated at over $14 billion for the month alone. Annualized, those payments push above $1 trillion pace, overtaking defense spending and approaching, in trajectory, the scale of Social Security obligations. This places the United States in an unusual position for a reserve currency issuer. The cost of borrowing is consuming the space normally reserved for domestic investment. At the same time, foreign holders are reducing Treasury exposure as a percentage of their reserves. IMF data published in its recent currency composition release showed dollar share slipping to the lower end of its multi-decade range, a trend that places even more emphasis on near-term demand. That shrinking demand collides with a political environment where spending is accelerating. Reuters reporting throughout the autumn highlighted the costs of reshoring initiatives, industrial subsidies, and AI-related infrastructure, which require expansive fiscal outlays even as tariff revenue covers only a fraction of new commitments. Higher interest burdens reduce budget flexibility as spending rises in every politically sensitive sector. In hypothesis testing terms, the system's strain becomes measurable. Increasing the supply of bonds into falling demand conditions would require either sharply lower rates from the Federal Reserve or a new class of buyers large enough to anchor the market. This is where Bessent's stablecoin doctrine enters the crisis. Bloomberg's coverage from mid-year noted that he has championed a regulatory framework he describes as essential for maintaining global dollar dominance, built around the idea that dollar-backed digital tokens could generate trillions in Treasury demand by 2030. The Treasury Secretary argues that emerging economies facing volatile local currencies might shift toward dollar-linked stablecoins, creating a structural pool of short-term T-bill buyers that could offset weakening appetite for longer maturities. He publicly stated that the administration intends to put a lot of thought into the stablecoin regime and use it to reinforce the dollar's reserve currency status. The core unknown emerges immediately: the current size of the market, at roughly $200 billion combined between leading issuers. According to data cited by the Wall Street Journal this quarter, the structure is far smaller than the multi-trillion-dollar demand Bessent envisions. The emotional pressure tightens when introducing the second variable. Stablecoin issuers do not always hold T-bills in direct proportion to their liabilities. Tether's latest reserve reports, cited by Bloomberg, show heavy allocations to U.S. Treasuries but also noted substantial holdings in alternative assets. Claims that Tether purchased more gold than major central banks appear in various commentary circles, but those assertions remain unverified. What is confirmed is that Tether disclosed significant bullion holdings as part of its diversification strategy. Diversification reduces full reliance on treasuries, weakening the reliability of any future stablecoin-driven demand surge. Credit assessments add another dimension. S&P Global downgraded its view of certain stablecoin reserve compositions earlier this year, warning that high-risk assets inside the pool increase vulnerability during liquidity shocks. Reuters explained that if redemptions spike, issuers would likely sell treasuries first due to their liquidity, pushing stress into one of Washington's most sensitive borrowing channels. This is where the hypothesis shifts from theoretical to operational. In a mass redemption scenario, stablecoin structures could amplify treasury volatility, not dampen it, at least in the short term. The emotional edge sharpens because the very mechanism designed to stabilize demand may, under duress, accelerate instability. As the domestic foundation shakes, another shock line opens across the Pacific. The Wall Street Journal published a report alleging that during a recent call between Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping, the American side conveyed messages to Tokyo suggesting that Japan temper its signals around Taiwan. Japan's government publicly rejected the account, maintaining that no such guidance was delivered. The contradiction between reporting and official denial forces a unique hypothesis test. Either Washington is moderating allies to preserve space for negotiations, or the reporting reflects incomplete or contested interpretations of a sensitive diplomatic exchange. Regardless, the geopolitical perception effect is immediate. If global observers infer that the United States is softening allied stances during a moment of financial strain, it invites questions about leverage, sequencing, and strategic confidence. Trump's own public remarks introduce a second thread. In comments recorded by U.S. networks earlier this season, he stated that Xi Jinping agreed to accelerate purchases of American farm goods, adding that he expected pleasant surprises from China and planned a presidential trip to Beijing in April 2026. He framed the relationship as constructive and emphasized ongoing dialogue. When placed inside the Treasury narrative, these statements form a direct causal linkage. The administration is pursuing economic cooperation with Beijing at the same moment domestic borrowing conditions tighten. This does not imply dependency, but the sequencing raises analytical tension. If China chooses to expand purchases, it strengthens U.S. farm states. If China reduces exposure to treasuries, it tightens fiscal pressure. If China offers symbolic concessions while limiting material ones, it shapes expectations without resolving structural issues. That structural dependence surfaces again through trade flows. Reuters data highlighted that China remains the dominant supplier for U.S. toy imports, controlling roughly 2/3 of the market even after tariff adjustments that pushed effective rates significantly higher. As holiday demand increases, elevated import prices filter directly into American households, linking tariff strategy to consumer pressure. Bloomberg analysis earlier this fall added that AI-related equipment and data center components also carry supply chain exposure to Chinese manufacturing, demonstrating that the economic relationship remains interdependent even during trade confrontation. Supply chain reliance actually feeds into fiscal stress by raising costs during periods of inflation. Now, a deeper tension starts to emerge in the rare earth sector. China, at this point, maintains overwhelming dominance in rare earth refining, controlling an estimated 85 to 90% of processing capacity, according to data reported by the U.S. Geological Survey earlier this year. The Financial Times has noted ongoing negotiations between Washington and Beijing over export conditions, with recent reporting indicating that China might apply end-use controls to limit shipments to industries with military connections. There are claims out there that Beijing specifically aims to block rare earth magnets from reaching defense contractors. These appear in policy commentary, but honestly, they remain unverified. What we do know is that Chinese authorities have definitely tightened export control regimes in areas linked to national security. A resource that underpins both civilian and military technologies lies in the hands of the world's largest refining power, right at the exact moment the United States is trying to rebuild its own domestic capacity. U.S. officials in Southeast Asia have attempted to redirect supply routes, and during a regional summit, Washington's ambassador to Malaysia stated publicly that Malaysia's long-term prosperity stems from integration with Western supply chains. That remark was widely interpreted as a subtle caution regarding Kuala Lumpur's interest in BRICS-related initiatives. Diplomatic messages become instruments in the contest for supply chain loyalty, linking rare earth access to geopolitical alignment. Every country choosing between competing blocs shifts the availability, cost, and security of critical mineral flows. As these pressures accelerate, the Federal Reserve actually becomes a second arena of uncertainty. Markets now expect new leadership that's more aligned with the administration's priorities, and Bloomberg analysis from late autumn showed rising forecasts for rate cuts in 2026 as fiscal pressure continues to build. Lower rates could ease Treasury servicing costs, but they also risk weakening the dollar, at a moment when structural demand is really the central concern. This tension frames the larger hypothesis. Cutting rates may stabilize borrowing in the near term, but it could also undermine the stablecoin-anchored demand strategy if the dollar's attractiveness erodes. Meanwhile, the Treasury continues issuing large volumes of short-term bills to avoid stressing long-duration markets. And honestly, that's a tactic that increases rollover risk if global liquidity tightens. On the stablecoin front, analysts such as Luke Groman argue that linear growth rates suggest the market may not reach multi-trillion-dollar scale within the timelines Bessent projects. His remarks, which are cited pretty widely in financial commentary, estimate that at $10 billion of monthly growth, stablecoins would take more than 2 decades to reach the $3 trillion threshold. This projection introduces a long-term contradiction. While U.S. deficits trend higher, the potential buyer base is growing far slower than what's needed to sustain issuance comfortably. Can the stablecoin framework meaningfully influence Treasury demand within a decade, or is it just a strategic narrative designed to buy time while domestic tools remain limited? On the geopolitical side, China's position strengthens through calm, incremental moves rather than dramatic gestures. Bloomberg noted that Chinese holdings of U.S. Treasuries have gradually decreased over the years, though the country remains one of the largest foreign creditors. At the same time, China's export controls, industrial subsidies, and internal rebalancing create leverage that grows quietly but steadily. When Trump publicly stated that he maintains a good relationship with Xi and expects to visit Beijing, it unintentionally highlighted the paradox. Washington is applying pressure on China in technology and trade, yet still seeking cooperation in agriculture, supply stability, and financial signaling. As rare earth negotiations stall, something Bloomberg indicated earlier this season when approvals failed to materialize ahead of U.S. holidays, the tension deepens. If Beijing enforces strict end-use screening, even civilian industries with partial defense exposure could face delays or reductions in supply. Aerospace producers, auto manufacturers, and electrical equipment firms may find procurement timelines tightening, feeding back into broader economic uncertainty. Factories adjusting schedules, suppliers renegotiating contracts, and procurement officers searching for alternatives that do not yet exist at scale. The fiscal picture darkens in parallel. WSJ projections suggest that without structural reform, interest expenses will continue rising faster than revenue during the next budget cycle. If rate cuts are delayed or insufficient, rollover auctions may occur under heightened volatility. If rate cuts are aggressive, they could destabilize the dollar. If stablecoins fail to scale, the Treasury loses a crucial pillar of its forward demand strategy. Every path contains risk, and the absence of a stable anchor becomes the defining feature of the crisis. By the time the administration finalizes the itinerary for the president's China trip, markets are already interpreting the move as a tacit acknowledgement of interdependence. Analysts at several major banks told the Financial Times that Beijing may extract concessions in exchange for cooperation, though the scope remains unclear. China could accelerate farm purchases, slow export controls, or offer symbolic support in the Treasury market. But each option would come with expectations. The hypothesis that Washington can negotiate from strength is now under scrutiny because the fiscal timeline is moving faster than the diplomatic one. If deficits rise another 10 to 15% next fiscal year, as some analysts forecast based on current spending trajectories, then even a modest decline in foreign treasury absorption could trigger auction volatility at the exact moment rare earth supplies tighten and trade costs filter deeper into consumer markets. That convergence is not a prediction, it is a possibility illuminated by numbers themselves. In a system defined by leverage, timing becomes the last variable Washington does not fully control. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.